Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for coming, regardless of how you got here. And I'm glad to see that there are gardeners here who haven't retreated into their bedrooms already and said, "Oh, there's a thunderstorm coming tonight. I don't want to have anything to do with anything that's alive and growing." So I think we get an impression as gardeners that things really do go to sleep outside of our windows when it gets too cold and too wet, typically. Who knows what will happen in our lifetimes and beyond in terms of global warming. And that's one of the issues that we have to keep checking back on when we're trying to assess what our garden and beyond our garden, all of the things that live in it, need attending to for. One of the things that I've observed in my 76 years is that I forget what in the heck was in my garden the year before, where it was, how it did, how long it's been since I planted it there, how often I watered it and fertilized it. And I've done what I'm sure every novice gardener has done, and that is I forget to look at what the size of the plant will be when it's mature. And over the winter, my memory goes even further bonkers. And when I get out there in the spring, I can't remember whether that's a plant that I pruned in the fall or whether I missed it last fall, and therefore I need to get out in the spring. But then I have to go back and check my garden information to make sure that that's a plant that should be pruned in the spring as opposed to the fall. And there's a lot to remember when you have even a small little plot outside of your patio, or even on your patio. Container gardening is even more of a mystery to most folks, and you can really make a lot of mistakes with container gardening, but that's for mostly another day. So what I urge you to do is to just make a simple drawing of what you have that you can still see and have some recollection of what you did for, with. If you remember places that you had to remove plants because of some issues, and that's typically because of a disease, which can be in the soil or it can be airborne. There's not a lot we can do with airborne, but I'm going to give you a couple of suggestions about what you can think about. One of the things that I think, again, novice gardeners do is that if it worked this year and the year before, then we figure it's going to work the next year. And particularly, you can see that this is primarily a vegetable garden, maybe entirely a vegetable garden. One of the things that is recommended by every ag university, every extension service in all of the 50 states, is that you do exactly this kind of Dear Diary because it's recommended that you rotate your crops. And I recall my dad in Indiana grew the most beautiful tomatoes. And he grew them in exactly the same spot. They got exactly as much water and fertilizer and sun every single year. And then every August they'd have to go down in the basement and put hot water on it and can them. And I thought, geez, we didn't even eat that many tomatoes. But what I've learned now, 60 some years after that episode, was that he was just very fortunate that in the clay of Indiana, which is a lot like the clay here in the Willamette Valley, a lot of diseases grow and they are able to overwinter in that soil. And a kind of a concomitant to that is, for example, if you grow roses. We tend to use some of these particularly herbaceous plants, the ones that aren't woody, we tend to use them for mulch. Some people compost them. But if you will remember right now to go out while you're doing your diary, but also while you're there, check the leaves, and if you're going to pull the plant up, check the roots to make sure that you don't see insects or any signs of disease, which would be, for example, black leaves. Roses, we all contend with black spot. Black spot is a fungus that's airborne, and it's actually a whole group of different types of fungi. but they float through the air. But over the winter, if they've stayed on the leaves that have either been pruned off or that have fallen off, they can overwinter, and they're probably going to be there next spring. And there's this horrible, in my view, understanding, if you will, that if you just get out there with a fungicide, something that kills fungi, at the right time in the spring, you can cure that. The problem is that fungicides are preventative. You put them on before the fungal spores start to take over the leaves. But an ounce of prevention, as they say, but back up the prevention, not spraying them in the early spring so that you're keeping fungal bodies from landing there and creating the spots, but back up and take the leaves away that may be the offenders for doing that. Same with insects. Many insects lay their eggs, beetles for example. They lay their eggs in the soil, and over the winter they pupate, and then when things start warming up, etc., they're hungry. And insects go through specific life cycles. At some life cycles, they're, for example, a cocoon, they're not eating. There actually is activity going, but you can't see it, can't hear it. But once they break out of the cocoon or become larvae, they're little eating machines. And then they pupate, they change shape, once again they morph, and then they become adults, and I'm using a broad brush here for insects, they come as adults. Then they don't eat anymore. They're just interested in liquid, because they have to stay hydrated, and sex. So for the insects that are in a vegetable garden, it fits into two life cycles. It's either food or sex, right. And I'm not talking about a college fraternity. Yeah. But you aren't going to see a lot of sex going on now, and maybe they're still chewing on your leaves. Some insects actually have 3 to 4 generations per year, and there are several species that are just now coming into either the 3rd or the 4th life cycle, and they're busy out there. So, again, knowledge is power in the garden, and if you can't remember that and can't remember to rotate, and let me clarify one thing about crop rotation. Our vegetables fit into families. So when you talk about rotating, what you're really talking about is rotating among the families, and there are 4 of them. I'm not going to go into them here because it's not a vegetable gardening class, but look into which plants are related to each other, because they're going to attract the same insects and acquire the same diseases. So now, what about the perennial plants? Well, as I reflected earlier, it's not so much that you're going to worry about having to rotate their places, because most of them, especially the woody plants, you planted there hopefully, or wherever you planted them initially, you want to leave them there. But apropos of when do you prune? I think pruning scares people more than any other concept in the garden, and because pruning can be a fall activity, depending upon the species of the plant, here is the simplest rule to remember, and this is just for flowering plants. Prune after the flowers are no longer beautiful. When the flowers are spent, that's the time to prune. Rule number 1, easy to remember, for the flowering plants. For all plants, never prune off more than 1/3 every year. And the reason for that is that you want, for example, let's say, take the lavender. Now, this is newly grown foliage, I can tell. I have 100 lavender plants on my property. And they will produce flowers. Then about now, sadly, they'll start to look pretty peaked. And you really should only prune off 1/3, which is going to take off the spent bloom, admittedly. But it leaves enough foliage down there that the plant can continue to photosynthesize and keep sugars stored in its roots, so it's ready in the spring to start the process all over again. So now, one other drop a footnote exception. You can prune dead, diseased, or dangerous plant material any time of the year. Now is a good time to start thinking about that, because you're going to have, while this plant's still relatively alive, you're going to have a better idea of what's diseased and what's just getting brown because it's fall. I've been out most of this week pulling off and pruning my 4 Japanese maples. And this is a good time to do it, not only because it's a little cooler and when I'm crawling around underneath these trees, I can tell the difference between the twigs that are brown that need to be removed and the branches that still have active foliage going. So timing of doing that kind of pruning process is something that you just learn with experience, but those 3 rules should serve you pretty well, regardless of what perennials, woody plants that you're dealing with. Okay, so one of the conundrums that we certainly haven't had to deal with, I think, in our lifetimes is the concept of leaving the leaves. Leaves are starting to drop. Maples especially are starting to change color, and they're beautiful, vibrant. And leaves do provide wonderful things in nature. Go out in the forest, you're not going to see any gardeners, no rakes, no blowers. Thank God for small favors. And what is going on out there in the forest that you can imitate in your own gardens in terms of leaving the leaves is to help create habitat for the creatures that we don't pay much attention to. And that can be birds. It can be pollinators. Did you know that somewhere in the neighborhood of 75% of all native pollinators actually live in tunnels, hives, down under the ground? So one thing you can think about doing is, this is called a hugelkultur. It is just a stack of wood, things, leaves that are down, branches, etc., and even herbaceous, so it's rotting, composted material. You can put that in there as well, and it provides a place for them to stay over the winter, a habitat. Now, we all grew up looking at these gorgeous pictures, maybe we've even visited Versailles. There's not a dead leaf anywhere in sight, right? And then you go home to your garden and you think, oh, my neighbor's I'm so embarrassed. I can't stand it. Well, this is nature in the middle, as we probably should think about leaving our gardens. But the conundrum is that we live in an area that has a lot of wildfires and other types of man-made fires that are coming close to our houses, destroying them. You know the news as well as I do. And so we have this, do I leave the leaves that are going to get dry and might make my house more susceptible to a fire getting close? And one of the things that they've learned from California on this topic is they ask that people clear their houses of anything combustible. You heard me right, anything combustible, 100 feet. Now, that's not going to stop cinders from reaching your roof, which is a whole other topic. But one of the things that you can do with these leaves, especially once they turn brown, is to compost them. An effective composting system has 1/3 green, so kitchen scraps, which is nitrogen, and 2/3 brown. And once the leaves turn, because it's carbon, once the leaves turn brown, the nitrogen is no longer there. And so you just have kind of a nature-made type of paper that you can put in. Shredded is even better to put in your compost bins. But if you're just leaving it in nature and trying to forget that it's there because you're so embarrassed by your neighbors looking at it, plant a variety of native vegetation, obviously. And this is something that you can do in the fall. I want to come back to that in just a second. It helps maintain water sources because it mulches the soil. So the mulch of these fallen leaves in your garden as well as out in the forest provides the ability for the soil to retain moisture because it's not evaporating. Now, that's less of an issue in the winter, obviously, than in the summer. But it also helps to provide cover not only for the birds, etc., that hibernate over the winter, but also for the roots of the plants that often, because of water or wind or whatever else, get the topsoil removed. So nature comes in with this layer of leaves and helps provide that mulch, and we don't have to do anything. We don't have to pay for it. Mm-hmm.
So are the leaves good up your vegetables?
Yes, leaves are excellent there. Yes, now there's one proviso, and it's a question of when the leaves are there. If the leaves are there, and this is true of pulverized wood, bark, not the big chips, but the shredded one, if they are too thick or there are too many of them, they keep water from getting through. The water can't get around in terms of shredded bark. They can't get down to the roots. The leaves have the same thing. You know, it's a hydration issue, or hydrology issue, that water sticks to water. And so you're going to get a runoff, and plants need water in the winter in the same way, but not in the same amount that they do during growing and hotter seasons. So you need to be sure that, and the second part of that is, be sure that you keep any mulch, whether it's leaves or some kind of wood mulch that you've brought in, away from the trunks of woody trees, because you're creating an environment for insects and pathogens, particularly fungi that live in that environment. And the leaves that we have carry the fungi. I'm not just talking about the rose leaves, but we have a lot of beneficial fungi that live here. And I'm not talking about beer, cheese, and bread. So, but you've, I'm sure, seen animals pulling together some of these dropped organisms and creating nests to protect their young and to keep them warm over the winter. So it's a balancing act, and hopefully you have, as I do, a part of your yard that has nothing. I never walk on it. I throw all of our clippings over on it because I know that I want those 150 bees to come over to my lavender, and if I don't have a close place for them to live underground, why do I have 100 lavender? Well, there are other causes, but okay.
You're saying that like putting up a light dusting of leaves on like raised beds or potatoes?
Yes.
Now, what about wood ash?
No wood ash. Wood ash for an entirely different reason. Wood ash is alkaline. Most of the plants that we have in our environment, largely because we have a lot of clay, most of them adapt to really acidic soil. That would be blueberries, for example. Blueberries need a really acidic soil. Hydrangeas, you can tell by the big leaf hydrangeas, you can tell by the color of the flowers whether they're in an alkaline, that would be pink, or an acidic, that would be blue. Yeah, it's kind of a litmus test in your garden. But if you start adding wood ash, you're creating an alkaline soil, and it's difficult for the plants to absorb the other nutrients because there aren't enough hydrogen cations. There's something for you to investigate over the weekend. Cations, Okay. So let's talk about soil. Perfect soil, which is called loam, is 25% water, 25% air, 45% mineral components, and again, perfect soil is 15% clay, 15% sand, 15% silt. And if you look at these under a microscope, which I urge you to just go look them up on the internet, it is just bizarre. Sand looks like these beautiful sea urchins or sea whatever they are, you know, the seahorses, you know, all colors of the rainbow, just muted. It's just gorgeous. Silt looks like some really boring cement. And clay, because it's layered, looks like lasagna. And it's between those lasagna plates, if you will, that clay is able to hang on to nutrients that get held long enough for there to be water available, and then the roots are able to take up the dissolved nutrients into the plant. So if you look at a map of the world, the areas in the world that produce the most food that we consume are basically clay, not sand or silt. Well, think of it. How many industries do we have in the Sahara? Yeah, doesn't work that way. And then organic material only makes up 5%. Now that can be both live organic materials, such as insects, snakes, worms, beetles, etc., that live in the soil. It also is the soil microbes, which can include I don't want to go into the list right now, but about 17 different types of microbes live in our soil. And a handful of our good old clay has over 1 billion bacteria. I haven't counted them myself, but I'm going to believe the people that have. Okay. Now, why am I mentioning this in terms of fall? Well, we start worrying about whether our soil is the right pH, and P stands for percentage, H stands for hydrogen, and that's the percentage of cations or cations. So hydrogen that has a positive or negative attraction is an ion. We start worrying about that when we see deficiencies show up in our plants in the spring, primarily, for example, yellowing. So that's chlorosis. And that typically means, depending upon where you see it in the leaf, that typically means that the plant is deficient in nitrogen. Nitrogen is critical for creation of foliage and photosynthesis. The problem, though, is if you wait until spring to figure out that you have a problem, you can't get that change, the soil amendments, effective enough in the short period of time before your plants need it. So getting a soil test in the fall and adding the recommended soil amendments will help your soil to adjust, if you will, so that by the time you're ready to grow something in it, it's the right pH. And if your soil is deficient in especially one of these macronutrients, most of the labs will give you a recommendation about how much to apply. Don't overdo it, and you may have to get somebody to help you to translate how much that means in, for example, a raised bed. But you can get these garden test things. There has been some research done to compare the $9 kits with a $20 lab test, and apparently the $20 is worth spending, especially if you have a permanent perennial plant, which you want to keep going year after year. If you're going to swap them out the next year, it's probably less of an issue. And so I want to tell you something about how to read these, but also how to read labels when you go, if you're going to apply some soil amendments, how to read this thing. On the label of a fertilizer, commercial fertilizer, and some potting soil, for example, you'll see the 3 numbers, 555, 10, 10, 10. So by weight, whether it's solid or liquid, it means this one, for example, it has 8% nitrogen, 0 phosphorus. That means there's nothing there to help root growth. And 24% potassium. Potassium is important for the growth of flowers and seeds. So if you have a bulb, you add this to it, it's not going to help that bulb grow roots. A bulb isn't roots. And I'm going to get to the handout for the root thing in just a second. So you can get a really... Okay, however you do it. Okay. The potassium is important for the growth of flowers. And one of the things that you can do is to keep your banana peels and plant them around your flowering perennial plants. It's always been something to plant to help roses, which you have for the flowers, right? And just put that in the ground, and eventually, as it decomposes, the potassium will become available to the plants. Cheap. Nothing. You just plant it. And the soil microbes are there to break it down. Yeah. It's a pretty cheap form of... And it's just recycling. You know, composting is Mother Nature's oldest form of recycling. But you might as well do it in your garden for zip. And you can even put the paper in, because the paper will... The little label, if it's wood... If it's plastic, no, but if... Yes. Yes. NPK. Right. The K is from the Greek word for potassium, because they knew this long before English was even created. So it's NPK. Yes. Alphabetical. And then there are 13 other micronutrients, but for the most part, you don't have to worry about those. Well, I'll show you in just a second why you might have to, but... Okay, I'm a master gardener, but also a master recycler. And where those two learning agencies came together was in composting. It truly is. As I said, decomposition, rot, is Mother Nature's oldest form of recycling. The atoms that were here when the earth was created are still here today. They just get mixed up into different structures, right? So you can make and use compost. You can compost all year round. The basic rules of decomposition to remember are, number one, you've got things in there that are alive that need to be nurtured. If you just put in a bunch of kitchen scraps, as I referenced earlier, you're adding nitrogen. But the soil is made up of largely carbon. So that's why in a compost bin, a third of it can be the nitrogen, the kitchen scraps, but 2/3 of it should be some form of carbon. A great way to use your junk mail or your newspaper. And if you shred them, you're making smaller surfaces so the microbes can break them down more quickly. But because the microbes are alive, they're really alive, they need the same things that animals do: water, the food that you're putting in, and air. So you also have to be able to figure out how you can incorporate air. Some people use pitchforks if they have it in open bins. For a black bomb like this, you can buy things that you go down there. It's a flange, and you pull it out. And so you're essentially mixing it up. That should be done on a regular basis. And it helps to prevent bad smells, ammonia. The reason that I mention that is if you've ever mown a lawn and you had grass clippings sitting and you say, I'll come back and deal with them later, and you come back and you can't get within 3 feet because it smells so bad. Well, that's ammonia that's been created by anaerobic bacteria that are trapped in there. Well, they like it because they can't live in oxygen. So they're making that bad smell. And you don't want to have a bad smell in your compost, so you want there to be this, thank you, you want there to be this constant changing so that there's air in there, oxygen, that will allow the aerobic bacteria to break down your materials in there. And how do you know when it's okay to use? Well, you can tell when, and some people have 2 or 3 bins like this, and they fill one up, keep putting in water, keep rotating it so the air will keep the aerobic bacteria happy. And then after it's full, they'll keep doing that, but they won't add any more materials to it. They'll go to a second one. Now, some of you may have seen the things that you turn. You're making compost that you turn. The problem with those, and at our ages it's nice on the back, the problem though is that there are no soil microbes in there. They can't jump from, and if you have concrete underneath it, they can't jump at all. But they can't get from the soil up into the mixture. Same with this. Put in a few handfuls of that good old clay, because every handful has 1 billion bacteria, and they'll start working for you. You'll also find under these black bombs that are next to the soil, you'll also find that there are red wigglers, Eisenia fetidus. And those are the worms that we use in worm composting. This worm tea is just either taking their castings, that's another name for worm poop, taking that, putting in a container, filling it with water, and you can use this worm tea, quote unquote, as free fertilizer. You could use it indoor plants, outdoor plants, etc. It doesn't flow through as quickly as chemical fertilizer does, but it has exactly the same NPK as you found in the plants that the soil microbes ate that then the worm ate. Now, these castings can be used directly in your garden. You can use them inside. I just gave a talk the other night, and I handed out little containers of worm poop, and the 8-year-old in the group said, well, that must smell awful. I said, well, smell it. And she said, it smells like soil. Yes. In fact, it does. I'll tell you, there's one drawback. For reasons I've yet to learn, you put that in your garden, and there's so much nitrogen in it. There is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but it's largely nitrogen because worms are vegetarians, right? So they're eating whatever gets put in there, which is largely nitrogen. You will get so much foliage on whatever plant then that you plant in the soil that you mix the compost in. And you don't have to mix it into the soil, but it will start reacting more quickly if you do that. It's cheapest form of, and you don't have, I'll tell you the great thing, you don't have to get social security numbers for the worms. You don't have to register it with OSHA. I mean, you just put them in there and they go to town. Now, worms have two activities in their life, food and sex. Kind of like the insects that we were talking about earlier. In fact, you can define everything in the garden in those two words. But anyway, the worms they have both sex organs. And so if you see them curled each other with the head on with each other, they're mating. Yeah, they're inseminating each other. So give them a little privacy. You know, they're not looking at, well, they don't have eyes. So, okay. But you will often find in your castings, you'll often find their eggs. You can see them, or the tiny little babies. Now, I get a little paranoid about that because I don't want to drown the babies. And so I let them sit for a while, and then they come up to the top because they need the air that's there. And it's moist anyway. But I give this out to a lot of the groups that I talk to, and I make sure to label it because you never know when it'll get in the wrong container. But, okay, here's what not to do. You saw in the pie chart earlier that good soil is 25% air, and it's the air pores in good soil that allows the water, the 25% water, to go through those pores to get down to the root level. So the worst thing that you can do is to compact the soil. Now there's a secondary problem here. I just put together a program called The Worms Beneath Our Feet and Our Worm Bins. And I learned that there are in an acre of land, healthy land, there are between 1 and 8 billion earthworms. Now, I'm talking three kinds of earthworms. I'm talking about the red wigglers that live underneath composting, rotting material, and that's their source of food. The earthworms that we think about can go down only as deeply as they can find air. Obviously, the more porous the soil, the further they can go. And then the night crawlers have been known to go down 6 feet. But they all have some of the same things. In addition to being two-sexed, they also are blind. They breathe through their skins, and they are what are called photophobic. That is, when light hits their skin, it's actually painful to them. The red wigglers have an additional, I think it's probably an advantage. They're called Icenia fetida. That's the Latin term for them. Fetid isn't a word that we use a lot much anymore, but our grandmothers did, and it meant foul smelling. Now, it's not their castings that's foul smelling, it's that they have glands in their skin, and when they feel threatened, they exude a smell that we can't smell, but that potential predators can, and they're less likely to get eaten. But I keep them, my worm bin, in my bathtub, and it doesn't smell any worse than anything else in the bathroom, and so I want to make sure that I'm keeping them healthy. The problem is I can't name them, and I don't have enough names that are both male and female, and so it gets frustrating after a while. But they can live for 2 to 5 years if they're in the right environment. And as I said, no Social Security, no, nothing. So now what about plant health? This is, again, a fall identification, and can I cure it in the fall? Up top, that's meant to show you that a tree has no bark much left on it. That can be because it has some kind of beetle that is infesting it, and we are undergoing all kinds of infestations of insects we never had to deal with before, and we have areas in Oregon that you cannot remove woody material from because you're taking that insect to a different part of the state. this on down here, you know what that is? It's a rhododendron, right? And rhododendrons are largely, you don't have to deal with them. However, if you see that kind of browning going on around the outside, it may tell you that the plant isn't getting enough water, again, during the growing season. Because like hydrangeas, for example, rhododendrons and azaleas have very shallow, fibrous root systems. So when the ground gets hot and dry, it affects the plants. The second thing that's not pictured here is if you have, and this is again a fall activity and you have a very short window to take effect. If you have notching on the leaves of a rhododendron, it probably means that you have beetles that live and carry on most of their life underneath the soil, but they come up at night and they eat and they notch out the leaves. Now, the reason that fall is an important time to attend to this is there is a beneficial nematode. A nematode is one of those soil microbes that I talked about. It's a microscopic worm. For each human on the planet, there are 8 billion nematodes. And they don't make a lot of news. You'd think that something more plentiful than us would make the news occasionally, but no. Well, these beneficial nematodes, and there are others that are not beneficial, especially if they get into internal systems, worms, dogs, cats get worms, same idea. Horses get worms. Oh, by the way, never get any horse manure from somebody unless you make sure that they didn't deworm the horse, because your worms will die literally overnight. Deworming works for any worm, right? Anyway, you can take beneficial nematodes. You can buy it in a little container like this. It looks like silicon or aluminum sparkles in it, but in there are nematodes, the worms. You fill it up with water, tepid water. You go out while the soil is still relatively workable before it freezes, etc., and warm. And you use this slurry. You water around your rhododendrons that have notched leaves, and you put this slurry on. The nematodes, the microscopic worms, will find their way down to the eggs and the larvae, depending upon what stage they're in, so that the beetles don't have a next generation. Because the nematodes have to eat too. So you can buy beneficial nematodes to deal with just that issue. The other thing, and some rhododendrons are very susceptible to either having in very bad growth patterns, or they don't produce buds at all, so they're not going to have flowers, and making sure that your soil pH and the nutrients are there. Now, I never water my 8 rhododendrons, and I never add any additional nutrients to the soil, but they like the clay, and there's a lot of organic material from all of the trees, etc., that are around. Up here, this forest is when you want to plant woody perennial plants. Now, they're all available in the garden stores in the spring, and we're all going nuts because we want to get there and get the choice one and get them in the ground as quickly as possible. That is absolutely the wrong time to be planting perennials. You're wanting them to be there over the winter when there aren't water and heat stressors. You want them to have enough water, which in most winters comes naturally, so that the roots can spread out, so that the next spring and summer there's less need for you to apply supplemental watering. So if you can hold off, or if you bought them in the spring and you managed to keep them alive through the summer, fall is the time to plant them. Now, this is the rule for most perennial plants. Whether they're bald or whether they come in a container, and by fall, they're probably going to be root bound. First thing you do is you water them in the container, whatever they're in. You want to make sure that there's as much water around the roots as possible. Then you dig a hole that is the same depth as their root ball, but twice as wide. And what you're wanting to do is to roil the native soil around them so that the roots can spread out into that area. And clay is, as you know, difficult to dig in for us. and they don't come with any materials that'll help them to dig into their surrounds. You water the hole really well, put the plant in, but before you plant the plant, pull the roots apart. And it's okay to cut them. They're going to grow back. You just don't want them to leave in these big balls. And what you probably, if you manage to keep them alive, what you probably didn't know over those previous months is that they're not absorbing water, they're not absorbing nutrients because there's just simply no space. They need to be able to spread out to do that. And that's a big problem with people who keep plants in containers, is that they don't realize that you have to look out for roots coming out of the bottom, or some plants are strong enough they can even break some pots. So checking a plant's roots, if it's in a container or if you're preparing to plant it outside, is important in order to give it a future, if you will. Do not put in, you don't have to put in fertilizer. For God's sake, don't put in potting soil. They're going to grow on their own if you do it the right way to plant them in the first place. And then finally, bulbs. Now, you have a handout. I learned this year, for the first time, I bought some, what was it? I think it was ranunculus. Anyway, I bought it 50% off, and because I never paid full price for a plant. But there were some scraggly little plants that clearly were bulbs, and I bought them and planted them, and they didn't do very well. But then I remembered that I still had the name of them, but I don't have it on this handout. And they said what they need to do is, as soon as the foliage turns brown, you need to pull them out of the ground. And that got me thinking, how many plants, bulbs that I have out there, are not coming back the next year because this is too cold. Our area is too cold. And we're generally in the USDA 7, and on the chart, the lower the number, the colder the average winters have been historically. However, within just this last year, the USDA has changed the zones because they've adjusted them. Some areas of the country are warmer than they have been historically, and some are colder. So it's important that you know what you have and whether it can be left there over the winter or whether they need to be removed from the soil cleaned off. And here's another critical thing. You can't hurt a bulb by applying, and this applies to corms, etc. You can't hurt a plant by adding some sulfur, elemental sulfur. It's a powder, because it is a preventative to keep fungi from growing. They can't grow on that surface. And it's absolutely good to use. It's not a chemical, it's elemental. It's an element on the element chart. So just sprinkle it on and then put them in a place that they're not going to get wet, that they're going to be kept above freezing at least. If you've got a cool basement or something like that, or a garage that you can keep them in, but it's the water getting to them that's going to cause at least as much damage as the low temperatures. And I gave you this handout to explain which bulbs you want to plant in the fall. Again, as I put in the note at the bottom, this may change depending upon whether you have a bulb that's a hybrid bulb. Now, hybrid and variety are different. All hybrids are varieties, but not all varieties are hybrids. And the question is, who's making changes in the DNA of the plant? Is it a human? If it's a human, then it's been hybridized. We're messing with the genetics of the plant. But Mother Nature has created varieties of plants for as long as there have been plants. So they have different requirements, and one of the improvements that humans tend to do is to make plants able to survive in environments better, and so they use the genes that they can acquire, and they may produce bulbs that are hardier, that can tolerate lower temperatures than the Mother Nature created ones. So just check. I can't possibly give you a handout that has all of those varieties on it, so this just says, heads up, keep your little tags when you bought it in the first place, and you'll probably find information on whatever container that they came in. But with the internet available, you can find it someplace. So, yes, ma'am. Yeah.
Dahlias, I'm going to have to dig my I shouldn't put them next to each other, should I?
No, leave airspace. Yeah, separate them. This is true of iris as well. And iris have somewhat of a similar issue because they, you have to plant iris on the top of the soil rather than underneath. They have to have that exposure to air and the sun. But they grow so rapidly that the rhizomes don't leave, again, a place for the roots that come out from the rhizomes to absorb the water and the nutrients. Yeah. So separating them and then again putting elemental sulfur on them, you can't hurt them. But yeah. So we take them up in the fall for various reasons. One may be a sensitivity to how cold it gets here, but it also just may because they need to be separated and replanted someplace else. And this is a good time to make sure that you don't have any rotting ones or ones that have an insect infestation that you weren't able to see during the year. You're going to cut, obviously, the foliage off, drop a footnote, leave the foliage in the spring. It may not look good enough for Better Homes and Gardens to come in and feature your garden, but if you remove, before it's completely yellowed, if you remove the foliage after the flowers are spent, what you're doing is taking away the plant's ability to restore food, carbohydrates, to the bulb or the corn or the root or the rhizome so it can produce flowers again the next year. You even create problems for the plant if you use anything to turn them over and then put a plastic thing around them. I mean, you see some people that as soon as the leaves on their tulips and especially their daffodils look bad, then they bring out and tie them down. Well, they're losing about a third of the space that the plant would otherwise be using for photosynthesis to get to the photosynthesizing cells. So leave them.
I have an iris question for you, because I actually have irises now.
Uh-huh.
And they started to, the tips of the leaves have started to turn brown, and I think it's because they're not getting enough water.
Probably.
Yeah, at this time of the year, it's been so hot. Are they able to survive that, or should I be out there watering them?
No. Don't go out and water anything at this point. They're rather like onions. Once they've completed their life cycle, you don't need to add supplemental water. You're just going to create the opportunity to get fungal rot. And if they've grown on top of each other, this mass is holding water from even getting down to the roots that grow below the rhizomes. So you don't have to water anything at this point. At this point, they're going dormant. Wait until the foliage is gone, and then pull them up, separate them.
Okay, sounds good. And then, now roses, they typically die off. Should we just leave them on the blooms, some die, and then others come up, and more buds. The ones that are dying, blooming, do you want to cut those off?
If you want your plant to rebloom, you need to, and it will, 7 times, 8 times, 12 times, depending on the variety, you can get reblooming, new buds coming up if you keep that cut back. But again, roses are the same as other woody plants. The general rule is don't cut off more than a third every year so that you leave enough. The exception to that is any leaves or plant tissue that has a fungal infection in it.
And some of that, I sprayed them with some stuff, which made a difference, actually. But it's like you say, be proactive.
That's right. And again, once the fungus has set its tendrils into the cell and they turn brown or yellow, too late. Yes, that's right. You either catch them in grade school or they're gone. Okay, I'm not sure what time it is. A couple of other plant protections. These I've talked earlier about shredded bark and bark chips. That looks like it's shredded. I wouldn't put it anywhere in my garden because of the water penetration issue. But there's something else that you need to be careful of when you're using mulches that are made of wood. There's some evidence to indicate that when you put this is all carbon, I mean it's lignin, but it's basically carbon tissue. When you put that on top of soil, it actually leaches nitrogen out of the soil. So you'll get yellowing plants. Now, if you take this and put it up around trees, other woody plants around the stems, the trunks, you're just opening yourself up for diseases and insect infestation. So to keep at least 2, and if it's a really large trunk, 3 feet away from the trunk of the tree, it really does help the mulch, so it holds the water in. But if that's holding water and fungal infections, and rarely, but occasionally bacterial infections, you don't want to subject your plant to that. You're doing it more harm than you're giving it good. But other kinds of plant protections include cloches, and these can be used in the spring as well, obviously. One of the things that isn't a fall issue, but I'm willing to bet that some of you may have seen some kind of mosaic viruses, and they're transmitted by aphids. So they call the aphid a vector. And a vector is something that's alive that carries a virus, which is not alive, it's just RNA, carries it to the plant, and then it becomes a part of the plant's DNA. It will never be the same plant. Just like with the viruses that we get, they're not alive. So once it's in your genetic system, it will never be removed. So you can't add an insecticide, a fungicide, herbicide. You can't kill it without killing the plant itself. But in terms of the fall, when it starts getting cold, and this is one of the several plant crops that will survive the winter. They're largely leafy, okay, spinach, collards, etc. But at night, when temperatures get close to or down below 30, they'll still grow, actually, if you protect them. And then you take it off during the day so that they're getting sun, and as a secondary benefit, the ground, the soil around them is warming up. So it's essentially providing a heating system for them overnight and keep them from freezing. We don't have a lot, but, hang on to your hats, a lot of snow and ice around here that causes problems for especially these large evergreens, the arborvitae that start to lose and use, Y-E-W, tend to lose their branches because the snow and ice get so heavy that it breaks them off. And once it's broken, woody plants don't grow back in that area. So it's going to be an eyesore if you are there, for how it looks. So this is actually gotten from the northern states, the Midwest, that know how to deal with this. So they put things around them that hold the plant together so that when the ice and snow hits, it's unable to pull the plant down and break it off. And then these are just other examples of ways that you can protect plants. Have you ever seen one of these? It's a cloche, and that's a French word, but cloches are also head ensembles. You've seen them on paintings from the 1700s and 1800s. But from a plant's perspective, it's glass. It does not, in many cases, it doesn't have an escape hole, which makes it a potential problem if you don't remove it in the morning, because not enough sun is getting through to be able to help photosynthesize or to warm the plant. And you need to have it open so that the plant can exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide. Do you know why it's important to sing or talk to your plants? Well, in the process of photosynthesis, plants take in carbon dioxide, carbon and oxygen, okay? They're creating carbohydrates, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So they have to get hydrogen from someplace, right? But you all remember your basic chemistry. The number of atoms that go in on one side of the equation have to equal the number of atoms on the other side of the equation. And in the process of photosynthesis, they have too many oxygen atoms. So they have to get rid of it. But they need the carbon dioxide that you're getting rid of. So you're trading your waste product, carbon dioxide, for their waste product, oxygen. Now you know why plants are so important to keeping the planet alive, other than the fact that they're the only kingdom that can produce food through photosynthesis, and they feed every other kingdom. That's why this stuff's important. Yeah. But anyway, if you want to go to the trouble of a greenhouse, it doesn't have to be year-round. You can put these up rather cheaply if you know somebody that knows how to build them.
They have a new book which just came out, which we got called The Light Eaters, which it's all about that.
Uh-huh.
We have a collection of copy of it too. It looks fascinating. And also they have stuff on planet sentience, or their equivalent of our intelligence or whatever.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, you mentioned light, and I said you have to take off during the day because the part of the light spectrum isn't going to get to the plants that they need to photosynthesize. The same thing is important for houseplants. If you have a houseplant, particularly one that you want to bloom, and many of them take more light than others, obviously, the succulents take more. But we put them in our houses. Back in the 40s, a little before I was born, people that flew airplanes asked the glass industry to figure out how they could keep the light that came in through the airliners' windows from causing the leather, primarily leather, to change color. Okay? Then it changed to vinyl, but it still bleached out. And so the glass industry put a coating on that kept the ultraviolet rays out, okay, in the visible light spectrum. Then a few years later, homeowners and commercial building owners wanted to figure out how to keep the red part of the spectrum out because that was what was heating up their houses, and they were having to expend energy and money to cool off buildings. So they figured out how to do that. The EV windows that we have, energy efficient, are coated with both ultraviolet and infrared coatings that keep those rays from coming in. What part of the visible light spectrum do plants need to photosynthesize? Ultraviolet and infrared. So our energy efficient windows may be efficient for those reasons, but for the plants, even the plants that are sitting in front of them in a window, they're not getting enough light to photosynthesize, at least to create flowers and seeds, which use incredible amounts of carbohydrates and therefore photosynthesis. Okay, we're getting close to the end here. Putting in cover crops. Cover crops serve a couple of purposes, and they can be planted right now. Some of them, the legumes have nodes on their roots, and they're nodes that don't contain any oxygen. They have a specific kind of bacteria in them, and that bacteria takes nitrogen, not oxygen, nitrogen, and it converts it from a gas to a molecule. Plants can only absorb molecules, so it combines those two molecules that we also use in our gardens, ammonium nitrate. That's a fertilizer. But the roots of the plants are able to do that through this bacteria, so they're actually putting available nitrogen, fertilizer, back into the soil for other plants to live on, and it doesn't cost a thing. The clovers, red clovers, are some of the most efficient ones to do this. The problem is, this is a vetch right down here. The problem is that you have to catch them, if you will, in the spring before they start going to seed, or you're going to have them everywhere in your garden. So it's a timing thing. But if they're enriching the soil over the winter, you don't have to add fertilizer, etc. And this is a fabia, so a different kind of bean, but they're also able to put in nitrogen to the soil. And I told you I'd come back to some of the cool weather crops. Spinach, obviously garlic, and this over here is some kind, it's 3 different kinds, no wonder I can't. But any of the cole crops will grow over the winter. So coleslaw, cabbage, etc. They're really hardy, but remember that you may have to protect them by using cloches. But now's the time to think about planting them, and hopefully planting them in a place that you haven't had them before, so you don't have some of those same problems. So I got these out of order, but there's a picture of our wonderful energy efficient windows. The other thing that happens indoors is that we get drafts coming in, something you need to think about, because if you have a cool or a temperature sensitive plant in front of a window and you have a draft, you're probably going to kill it in the course of the winter. Now's the time to figure out where the drafts are and to block them. Same idea for putting them next to a door that's indoor, outdoor egress, ingress. You want to keep plants away from there if they're going to be sensitive to that temperature. And some of them, just a few degrees will determine whether you keep them alive. The biggest mistake made for container gardening, whether it's indoors or outdoors, is a lack of drainage, because it has the perfect environment for fungi to grow. You get root rot, which is kind of an umbrella term for all of these fungal infections. So now's the time, if you're going to bring plants inside or bring in houseplants, to make sure that you have good drainage, drilling holes. And the best advice for literally any kind of container, especially indoors, is to have ones that are small enough that you can put in a sink, and 2 or 3 times during those winter months and summer as well, run tap water through them so that it drains. It helps to wash out some of these fungal pathogens, but it also, you've seen when you've watered with water-soluble fertilizers that you get this kind of gray film on top. That's mineral salts that didn't get dissolved, and they just are sitting on top of the plant. They're not getting down to the roots, so they're not doing any good. Now, you can also have little fungi that grow on the top that look a lot like that, but they're not going to be flat and dry. They're going to be worrisome for you. So temperature is an important thing for indoor, but outdoor plants as well. And finally, the pests. Slugs. Now's actually the time to think about how you're going to control next year's slug population if you have them. That's an adult mama slug with eggs. They will start hatching later in the fall, and so the time to add whatever you're using for your slug control. Sluggo is good. Don't bother to buy the ones with all the additives to it. To put it outside so that you're staving off next year's population from even growing. And the best time to do that is at night, because they're going to start moving around at night. You can also put out containers of beer. They're attracted to the smell, and they climb in there and then drown. But I'm not into creating alcoholic slugs, so, Can you see the scale? This is a spider plant that I had growing outside, and this was the only stolon, which is an above-ground rhizome, essentially. It was the only stolon that got that on it, and it's impossible to get rid of. Scale. They're like bugs. They're able to punch into the cell tissue and suck out the carbohydrates. That on the bottom left is a mite. Mites do the same thing in terms of sucking off, and if you're going to bring plants inside, make sure that you're not bringing ones in that are infested. You'll often see little cobwebs with mites, but you have to look for them really, really carefully. And these are various types. Well, that up there is mealybug. I managed to kill off 50 orchids by bringing one home that had a mealybug infestation, and it broke my heart. But you can't get rid of it. Just impossible. There are too many nooks and crannies in our houseplants for that to happen. And this is, again, the leaves with rose leaves that have infections that you need to get rid of those leaves because you can see the black spots. And they just cut them and take them out of the garden. Get them as far away from those roses as possible because they overwinter. Weeds. Dandelions are a bane, but I suggest to you that they're one of the best flowers for pollinators that we have. So if you can work out a compromise with your neighbors, say, I'll leave the dandelion flowers, but before they go to seed, I'll cut off the heads, so they're not going to float over to your property. Clover, well, I have mixed feelings about clover. It's a legume, but my gosh, it grows just so fast. But again, when it's in its flowering season, it's usually covered with some form of pollinator. Anybody have spurge in your yard? Yeah, there's spurge and spotted spurge. That's actually kind of pretty. It's just an annual, but getting it out before it goes to seed is critical. And this is a resource that I suspect some of you have never heard of, the NPIC. It's actually an organization located at Corvallis. If you go to their website, you can learn more about pesticides, organic pesticides, chemical pesticides, how to use them, what not to use them on, which ones are available to homeowners, which ones are controlled, essentially can only be applied by licensed operators. I probably go to this website twice a week because I answer so many questions on Ask an Expert. Yeah.
That spurge, so I have spurge, actually want to get rid of that stuff, right?
Well,
It's in this plant right now, basically.
Like about a month ago. It becomes a lot like the taproots of dandelions. It doesn't technically have taproots, but the root system becomes so large that it's nearly impossible to get rid of it. I'm here to advocate for non-chemical methods of doing that. So in the same way that they've developed the probe things to get the dandelion taproots out. Now, let me tell you one other thing. If you can get at these early enough, you don't have to use a chemical. Now, I use that term kind of loosely. University of Maryland Extension has done some research, and they applied 20% vinegar to seedlings. They found it to be as effective as Roundup. But you have to do it while they're seedlings. Once they develop a taproot, it's too late. The vinegar that we have in our refrigerators is only 5% acidic, but you can get 20%, you can actually get 30%. It has been used agriculturally starting down in Texas, and it's now expanding. And you can find it at some of the garden supply or the farm supply stores around our area. Just don't dilute it, but you can spray it on, you can pour it on. I actually use it as a cleaning chemical. Technically, it's a chemical, but you need to be careful that you don't get it on your skin, and especially that you don't get it in your eyes, because it can be dangerous that way.
I had a friend whose father used to make him use Roundup on the weeds every single day, and he ended up getting lymphoma.
Yeah.
Unfortunately,
Right.
his father made him do it.
Yeah. Well, the farm workers in several states are experiencing that same fate. And now's the time to do your cleanup. In the same way that our fungal spores can linger on the leaves of roses and other of our woody plants, they can survive over the winter in the driest, coldest of potting and native soil, especially if they're in their containers. The other thing is to clean up your garden tools. This is just sand and linseed oil. So if you have any kind of metal, doesn't matter whether it has a plastic handle or not, if you keep that in that mixture over the winter, they won't rust. And that's true even if they were wet when you put them in. Of course, you're smart enough that you dry them off before you put them in there. And then you can take them out if you need them over the winter and stick them back in there. But don't let your tools continue to have soil on them over the winter. And you may have to use some aluminum or something to get it off, but you're just asking for bacteria that are so tiny to exist there over the winter, and they don't need much to keep. They need air and a little bit of water and a little bit of food, and that's probably on your tools. Same place you get the 20% vinegar. Linseed oil is available every place. Yeah. And it's absolutely organic. It's from linseed. I wouldn't want to eat it, but it works. Because oil and water don't mix, and fungi and bacteria can't live in oil-based solutions for the most part. That's not true across the board, but close enough for government work for our purposes.
Kris, what's that plant and you touch it and it's like it basically has all its little seeds on springs and they go flying everywhere.
Yeah.
That's a good one. That's what that there. It's like you just brush
There are about 8 of them that I can think of.
Evolutionary adaptation.
Yes, actually, I showed you a picture there of vetch. The vetch that had the little purple, pretty purple flowers. And then there are little seed capsules that go with it. And it's one of those good news, bad news situations. It too is a legume, so it's nitrifying the soil, but it has enough seeds that if you have one plant one year, you're going to have 25 at least the next. Of course, you can say that of columbine as well. That's nearly impossible to get rid of because it has such a strong root system. But there is also hairy vetch, and I wonder if this is what you're talking about. It attaches to your clothes as you walk through it. But there are a lot of what we call weeds that give off hundreds and hundreds, which is why, like the dandelion, timing, cutting them back before they go to seed is more preventive and better for the environment.
I have another weed. It's kind of like a succulent,
Okay.
in that it has a thicker leaf. And you never see it bloom. I don't know where the seed comes from to spread, but, and it really doesn't have too much of a root system when I hold it. But yeah, it's,
Because many plants spread underground by rhizomes, so they may not have seeds, okay? And some plants have both. Grasses spread through underground rhizomes, right? They come up. Ditto with the bamboo that your neighbor planted. The running bamboo, the culms come up everywhere, okay? But grasses have both underground rhizomes, but they also form flowers and have seeds. So they're intent on living. Now, technically, bamboo is a type of grass, but the grasses that we're referring to right here are turf grasses. And there are many ground covers that if you don't have an enclosed place, they'll take over every place. They're not technically invasive. They just don't stay in their assigned seat. I'm giving a program to the Sandy Library in October, I think it is, on alternative ground covers. It's alternative to what? Probably turf grass. But some of them are worse than turf grass. And I'm not fond of turf grass, but you can't believe how they take over. So, okay. Well, thank you for your time. You're welcome. I hope you learned. I've been a lawyer for 51 years, and I was a judge for 25 of those. So, no, not a teacher until I retired. So.
I can see you as a judge.
thank you.
I can see you as a judge.
How do I turn this all off?
Oh, I'll take care of it. Yeah, I'll delete your.
Well, actually, I was a juvenile court referee. Then I was elected to the bench as a circuit court judge in Multnomah County. And after about 2.5 years, I started doing settlement conferences because I'd been a family law attorney with a mediation interest. And another judge was doing settlement conferences on civil cases. And he needed help, so I raised my hand. Within 2 years, I was doing nothing but settlement conferences. I gave up my courtroom and just started helping people in civil and domestic relations cases settle their disputes. Had in the next 22.5 years, I think it's 14,000 cases, and 95% of them settled. Now, 95% of cases settle anyway, but just not early in the litigation process or as cheaply. And it turned out to be fascinating. I taught at the Judicial College for 15 years, so I guess I was a teacher. I was asked to go to Argentina to meet with some judges and mediators down there. Got to do the same thing in London to the Women's Legal Society. And then shortly before I retired, I was asked to go to the Philippines and teach mediation, interestingly, between their electric system and their customers. But of course, the customers have no leverage. So it was kind of a joke that they were actually going to negotiate with their customers. But I got to go to the Philippines.
Fascinating. Goodness. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
You must have so much fun out in your garden, I would imagine, since you're so aware of everything that's going on. It must be pretty intense.
You want to see a picture of my front yard?
Yes.
I keep referencing. I've already showed you pictures of my new. Well, here's our back patio. Since I fractured my foot, I couldn't do anything but continue building. So everything beyond the fray is a mess. Oh, this is our neighbor's tree that fell on our home. Yeah. Oh, this is my husband, John Rice. His mother, Betty Roberts. And his stepmother is Barbara Roberts.
Oh, I see.
Oh, this is out of our front window, or front door in the fall. Isn't that gorgeous? Yeah. More cat. I'm gonna get you. I know. I'm trying to. Oh, here's my front.
Looks like mine, except I have mint that I had one little plant
Okay.
in my,
Yeah.
and it's covered the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Any idea what I should do about that? I mean, the bees seem to like it.
They do. The only good chemical is elbow grease.
Yeah, I keep
I mean,
removing
if you
them.
don't want to use Roundup, which I don't.
No, I don't.
I know, I made the mistake of planting some oregano out initially before I knew what I was doing. And I'm still digging it up. And I have about 5 plants.
Well, I let it go because I thought it was pretty, but now I'm thinking,
No, anything in the knit will become invasive.
so,
And they're all Mediterranean, in the native state. And so when it dries out, they just go. And they don't mind the cold, they just give up for the winter and come back in the spring.
yeah.
Anyway. I know.
Thank you, this was really fascinating.
You're welcome. Oh, good. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Kris.
Yeah.
That's really awesome.
Okay, I'm gonna try not to steal anything, so. Okay. I have copies of this. Can you give them,
Yeah.
or leave them at the front desk or something for
Something like
people?
that, yeah.
Or if somebody contacts you, if there really was anybody on the screen? I was on the screen. You're
Really
welcome.
appreciate it. Drive safely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and if I don't see you before you move, why,
Yeah.
be safe. So,
Thank you.
so you're gonna retire.
Yeah, I'm gonna retire. It's Make smart, do that kind of stuff. So it should be
I
good.
love retirement.
Yeah, I know. It's doing well for you. Be safe and enjoy.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, take care.
Thanks for your help. I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Awesome. Really appreciate
Have
it.
a good day.
You too. Take care. Oh, thanks. So nice to have volunteers. We used to have to do this all ourselves, and then we have to try to deal with the computer, and it would inevitably malfunction at the last second. So this is so much better.